Hello everyone, Crash here, this is RTA Motorsports, and today we're going to be discussing very quickly a question that I get on this channel quite frequently, and that is, what do I prefer, the Oculus or the Vive? Here we go.
Welcome to RTA Motorsports.
So real quick, I'm just going to say we're not going to really discuss any sort of specs on this video because there is just a billion of videos out there and publications discussing the specs. What you really need to know is that essentially the resolution is the same, and since April with the new iteration of the Vive that's out, it looks exactly the same, but the weight out of the box is exactly the same between the two, 470 grams. So I am going to discuss one pro and con between the weight of the two headsets, but take that with a grain of salt because if you buy the newer version, newer than what I have as far as Vive goes, that opinion would probably change. So the answer that I'm going to give you is not really as cut and dry as you would probably like, and that is because it really is a big depends. What are you playing? What are you doing with it? What do you expect? And that really isn't something a lot of you want to hear, but it really does play that sort of way in the end. What I mean by that is the Oculus and the Vive are two totally different headsets. They're two totally different implementations on how they track and how they work. The Vive uses an outside-in sort of tracking where the Oculus uses an inside-out. This has infrared LEDs that is picked up by a camera, an optical sensor that is giving the tracking information to the computer, where this uses lighthouses that sort of project a laser grid over the room, and these sensors pick it up, and this delivers the information of tracking data to your computer. So that creates a little bit of a difference also when it comes to setups. That's first place we're going to start, and I do got to give the win of setup to the Oculus because, well, you don't have any sort of power cords whatsoever you have to use. It's amazing because as an owner of the Vive, now I do got to say as a disclaimer, this is not my headset. This was actually given to me just as a test from one of my good friends, and this is his Oculus CV1. Now this here you plug into your computer using just an HDMI cable and a USB 3.0, and the sensors themselves plug into your computer using a USB 3.0. That's it. There's no power cables. Now with the Vive, the setup is quite a bit different. You have to mount lighthouses to opposite ends of your room, either through using tripods or hard mounting them to your walls. And then each lighthouse requires a power cable that goes through your wall. And then the Vive itself has its own breakout box that requires its own power cable to the wall to power the headset, as well as you have the HDMI and USB cables that go to the computer. So there is quite a bit more setup that's involved with the Vive, whereas the Oculus, I was up and running in about 10 minutes. Most of that time was spent just downloading the Oculus software. The Vive can take over an hour to set up because, let's face it, you have to mount things to your wall. Angles need to be correct, and you have to find power outlets to really kind of get everything up and running, which shouldn't be too big of an issue, but you may need an extension cord here and there. But what does all that setup give you with the Vive? Well, that gives you room tracking and room scale. The Vive and the Oculus kind of work the same way in that sort of aspect, where you can kind of drift between same titles between two different headsets here. You have Revive, which is software that allows you to play most Oculus games on the Vive, and the Vive, most Oculus games on the Vive, and the Oculus can play most Vive games, but room tracking doesn't work nowhere near as well as the Oculus as it does on the Vive. The Vive, you could pretty much lay down on the floor and take a look at a blade of grass, if there is one, in whatever sort of experience you're in. As long as you're not being obstructed in the view of the headset to one of the lighthouses, you're still being tracked at all times. And I find that that sort of experience is what gives a wow factor to a lot of my friends and family that come over and try this headset. It just blows them away as to the freedom that you have in the headset With the Oculus, after trying the Vive, it works well in standing experiences and in seated experiences, but when you try room scale, when you really try to move around in an open space, that's when you start seeing the limitations on the tracking. The further away you go from the optical sensors, that's when it really starts having issues with tracking. Yes, if you have the touch controllers, then you have 2 sensors, but it still doesn't work as well as I would like. You start noticing the limitations of the headset, and if you're used to the Vive sort of room scale technology and you like playing those types of VR titles, you're going to feel a little confined in the Oculus and always aware of the limitations with tracking as opposed to the Vive. Not saying that it's bad experience at all. If you're just joining into the VR experience, the Oculus may be amazing to you, and it is amazing to me still, but the VR does that sort of room scale tracking better. Now, if you have a smaller room, the Oculus may just be just fine. But my room is at the larger end of what is acceptable for VR tracking for the Vive. It's about 15 by 15. And once you get to that sort of room size, that's when the Oculus really starts to struggle with its room scale. But a lot of titles with the Oculus have really made it sort of optimized where you don't need room scale experience. And then it works beautifully. Just like, you know, the title The Climb or any sort of titles out there, a lot of them you're kind of standing in one place, rotating around, and that's where the Oculus really shines, as well as seated experience. Also, the software side of it, the Oculus uses something called asynchronous space warp that really allows it, especially in the way of sim racing, a lighter system to run it very smoothly through all aspects of VR. Whereas the Vive requires a more powerful system to get the same sort of perceived performance and frame rates. The Oculus, I noticed especially in iRacing, for me was a much more smoother experience. It was providing a greater amount of frames in situations where the Vive would sort of stutter. The Vive would stutter around Spa, especially sort of towards the pits. And I was noticing stuttering even if I had 90 frames per second. I was still noticing stuttering even with all reprojections off. I would still have 90 frames per second, and sometimes I would have stuttering and sort of artifacting on the screen, whereas the Oculus, I never had any sort of that issue. And when I had a bunch of cars on the track and we were streaming at the same time, if it ever went reprojected, which was normally around the pits in the Oculus, it never felt like my frames were cut in half. I never noticed any sort of jittering or anything like that. It still felt really smooth, whereas the Vive, it was noticeable. You noticed when the frames weren't sort of going in that area. And in the way of iRacing, being that this is a sim racing channel, we're kind of focusing on the sim racing titles a little bit more. In the way of iRacing, the Vive for me is having some issues where I get this sort of every once in a while delayed motion tracking, where if I turn my head a half a second later it moves, and it's only relieved until I hit the reset VR head mount display button on my wheel that I have mapped in the sim. I don't have to turn the headset off, I don't have to exit its sim, but once I kind of just reset the head display, I notice that all those tracking issues and stuttering is gone for about a good few minutes, and then it sort of kind of creeps back again. I have had that experience with both overclocked and not, and just so you can know, my system is a Ryzen 7 1700 overclocked to 3.8 gigahertz. I'm running 16 gigs of RAM, running at 3200 megahertz, and I'm running a GTX 1080 Ti. And both overclocked and not, I've had this issue with the Vive in iRacing. And with Oculus, I don't have any issues like that whatsoever. Now, in the way of comfort, I do gotta say that if you own a Vive Pre or the first generation Vive that was released before April, this headset is quite a bit heavier than the Oculus. And now I do have the deluxe audio strap mounted to it, which adds more weight to the stock headset. The way it sits right now, I almost feel like the Vive is nearing to double the weight of the Oculus, and it's noticeable when it's on your head. You do feel the added weight. It almost feels like you have a racing helmet on your head, that sort of weight distribution. The deluxe audio strap does allow it to be cinched down to your head a little bit tighter and kind of spread out the weight a little bit more uniform. Feels more like a completed product, but it doesn't really distract you too much from that weight. It does feel like you're wearing a helmet on your head, which in racing sims is fine. It's welcomed. this feels more like a hat. It's very light, it's very airy. The point of contact on your face is very thin. It doesn't really cause me to feel too uncomfortable at all. It doesn't really cause me to feel too hot within the headset. I can do long racing sessions. I may get a little sweaty, but nowhere near as bad as with the Vive. The Vive almost really kind of cranks the heat, really locks in heat on your face, as well as it's radiating heat. So it's just a hotter headset all around. But it does seal a lot better. And if you're looking for a headset that really seals and really brings you into that immersive sort of feeling, then that's where the Vive really comes to its own. Its head strap design now with the deluxe audio strap is really good at cinching it down on your head without feeling too tight. And then the faceplate design is such that it actually conforms to my face really well. I do have an aftermarket pad on here, but even with the stock pads, wearing glasses, perfectly comfortable, but just the shape of it is a lot more comfortable for my size of my face. And I noticed that there's no light bleed with the aftermarket pads on here, especially over the bridge of my nose, whereas the Oculus, especially if I'm in the simulator, I could pretty much see my knees while I'm racing. Granted, I'm not looking down at my legs at all, but if you look down, you could see your legs. Which is pretty distracting if you're doing any sort of experience that doesn't require a lot of forward sort of focus. If you're like in a scenic sort of experience, you're going to notice that when you look down with your eyes, you can see the ground, and that will kind of pull you out of that immersive nature. This is a much sharper angle, and with that sharper angle, I do have contact on my face only here, 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 and here. I do have contact with the pad on my face, but that also creates an air gap and also pressure points on these four corners. This nose cup design is such that I pretty much, my nose doesn't fill that at all, and I can see all the way down in here straight out, and I can see all the way to my knees when I'm sim racing. And when you're sim racing and you're in a race, you're not really distracted from anything but in front of you, so it's not a problem. But I can see in other experiences, when you're wearing the headset, when you're moving around, it really can kind of maybe pull you out of that immersive nature, where there is no contact with the outside world. Once you actually have these headphones down, the headphones seem to grip on my ears a little bit tighter, almost seal out the outside world a little bit more than the headphones on the Oculus, and you feel like you are separate from the world that is around you. Now discussing the controllers, I do gotta say that the Oculus Touch controller, being that now they're using a sort of bundle method with their Oculus Touch, and they're gaining a lot of customers. A lot of people are gaining the Oculus Touch controllers, and the Vive comes with the Vive controller. I do gotta say the Oculus Touch controller is the clear winner here in almost every way possible. The Vive controller is not a bad controller in any way. It's just a lot of the titles you have to learn the controls. It doesn't, you would think a lot of the grabbing sort of motions would utilize this here, but in some titles it's actually mapped to the trigger and so on and so forth. It's not really super ergonomic. It's very front heavy. It's kind of clunky when compared to the Oculus Touch. The Oculus Touch did come after the Vive controller, but you do have this grip button here that seems to always be a grip button, and this front trigger seems to always be a front trigger, and the design of the analog stick and the two buttons on the front there are very comfortable to get to when you're using the controller, and it feels very weighted in the palm of my hand, so I don't have to grip it that hard to hold on to it. Now I know that there are Knuckles controller coming out for the Vive soon, or they're being worked on. I don't think that they're coming out very soon, but they're not out yet, so we're not comparing those because we never used them. But in the case of this controller here, it's very light, it's very compact, and it just weighs in your hand very nicely, that it doesn't really distract you from any sort of VR experience you're in. I truly really like these controllers and their design. So in the end, I really like both headsets for different reasons. I really like the Vive for the room tracking, room scale, and almost sort of jack of all trades sort of nature of it. You could use it in a lot of different situations. You could use it in sim racing, you could use it in room scale. There's a bunch of titles and there's a bunch of third-party things that are coming out for it, and it almost feels like a sort of Android-y sort of open source nature to it. Whereas like TPcast is coming out with a wireless sort of solution for this. The deluxe audio strap you could upgrade to. There's tons of third-party VR gaskets for your face that go in there. And Vive sort of, they kind of encourage that third-party nature. Companies sort of creating products for it. Whereas the Oculus feels more like an Apple sort of product, where it is what it is, and it's very simple to use. It's very simple to get into. Everything feels logical, and if you like the open source sort of feeling, that might kind of pull you a little bit more to the Vive community. Now, the headsets themselves, the biggest difference when I'm wearing the headset I would notice is the screen brightness, and that by far, depending on what you like, is a big sort of win for the Vive for me. I love brighter sort of vibrant images, and there's a huge sort of contrasty sort of feeling. It really makes you feel like the world is popping that you're looking into. But there's a downside to that. On long racing sessions, I do notice that my eyes sort of burn towards the end of the session. Now, my eyes are a little bit sensitive. I do wear glasses with a blue light filter on them, and because my eyes tend to burn after a while. The Oculus has a softer, sort of darker, less contrasty, and less bright image. Now, I think part of that has to do with the design of its power delivery, because there's no power cable going to your wall. It gets all of its power from your computer, which on the bright side, that's a very sort of easy solution to set up for someone that's doing it for their first time. But on the other side of it, you don't get that bright image. Now, it is, when you go from one headset to the other, there is a big difference, but when you're just wearing the headset, if you just buy one or the other, you're never really going to notice the difference. I only really notice the difference because I have both the headsets in the studio right now, and we were jumping back and forth. And visually, I like the appearance of the brighter sort of image, but after long racing sessions, it did sort of fatigue my eyes, and I felt like I needed to rest because my eyes were just burning. Whereas in the Oculus, I always felt comfortable in the headset, and it never had that sort of eye fatiguing sort of feeling. So I like the Vive image, but the Oculus headset and its brightness may be better off for me in the long run. Which one is better? Well, as you can see, it really goes into what are you doing with it and what do you expect. If you like sims, if you like flight sims, maybe Elite Dangerous, maybe racing sims, and you really don't see yourself doing too much in the way of room scale, and if you watch videos of titles like Pavlov and you're not really too excited about it, which is a first-person shooter that uses a lot of room scale, if you're not really too excited about things that are room scale-y sort of nature, then the Oculus is a clear choice for you. You could get a lot more frames on a lighter system with the Oculus because the asynchronous space warp is just a smoother sort of experience at the moment. But if you want a good all-arounder and you still want to experiment with the maybe the TPcast wireless tracking solution that they're coming out with, and you want an open source sort of feeling product where a lot of add-ons you could buy for it, and if you want to mess with room scale as well as maybe some sims, then the Vive is really going to be your clear choice there. And it really comes down to, like I said, you have to be honest with yourself. What do you really think you're going to do with this headset, and how often do you think you're going to use it? So I'm Crash, this is RTA Motorsports. I hope I clarified some of my opinions on the headsets, because this is a question I get quite often. Which one do I like the most? Well, it's hard to say. It really comes down to, I like to do a lot of different things. Personally, if I'm iRacing, I want to use the Oculus. In any other situation, really the Vive is the best for me. And to be honest with you, I've been ignoring iRacing a lot lately in the past few months, only because of the performance I get within the Vive. So that is something to say towards the Oculus. So really, I can't really make up my mind. They both have their pros and cons. So sound off in the comments. Which one do you like the best? Which one do you own if you already own one, and why? I'm Crash, this is RTA Motorsports. We're going to be doing a lot more reviews. We have a lot more reviews we really need to get to. So see you all next time.